5 women knocked on his door in the dead of winter, and the silence that followed changed all of them forever. Before the snow ever touched the roof, before the wind learned his name, Reed Callahan believed he had already lived the rest of his life alone, and nothing would come to test that belief. He was wrong. And the night 5 Apache widows stepped out of the frost and into his clearing would change everything he thought he understood about silence, shelter, and belonging. Before we dive into this story, remember to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Late November of 1882 arrived early in the high hills above Silver Butte, Colorado Territory. The kind of early that carried frost on the wind and warned a man not to expect mercy from winter. Reed had already sealed the cabin, windows with oilcloth, and stacked his last cords of firewood against the wall. He wasn't expecting company. He never did. The nearest town lay 12 miles downhill through rock, timber, and snow. The nearest neighbor had died in the spring. The cabin stood alone, squared against the slope, built by Reed's own hands 6 years earlier when he left the army and decided he'd rather talk to goats than to men. Reed was 32. Before the cabin, before the quiet, he had worked as a translator, Apache, Spanish, Comanche, useful to the military when they wanted borders instead of blood. But he had seen blood anyway, too much of it. He had seen young women shot during raids, children shoved into wagons, old men left half buried in their own blankets. And when he tried to speak about it, no one listened. So he left. Since then, silence had suited him. That afternoon, he was splitting logs behind the cabin, thick spruce still wet with sap. His gloves were torn at the thumbs, his boots cracked at the heel. He swung with a clean, steady rhythm, not for exercise, not to clear his head, but because winter was long and firewood burned fast. A kettle heated on the stove inside, goat meat waiting to stew. Then the quiet changed. Not the wind, too steady for that. Reed froze mid-swing and listened. Bootsteps, several, light. Careful, human. He moved around the side of the cabin, hand near the revolver at his belt, not drawing yet. As he cleared the porch and stepped past the split-rail fence, he saw them. 5 women stood at the edge of the clearing, where snow met scrub. No horses, no wagon, just bare feet red with cold, wrapped in rags. Dresses that might once have been leather or cotton, now patched, torn, crusted with frost. Blankets hung from their shoulders, barely preserving what dignity remained. One of them, the woman in front, curvy, dark hair tied back with sinew, stepped forward. Her mouth was dry, but her eyes were steady. Reed didn't move. She didn't beg. She spoke plainly. They needed a place. One night. Nothing more. Reed looked at her, then past her, saw what she hadn't said. The younger one behind her had blood streaked down her thigh. The tallest held her arm, as if something had been pulled loose. One woman carried nothing but a small cloth satchel. These weren't drifters. They were survivors. Reed scanned the tree line. No posse, no riders. He remembered the last time he'd let someone inside. 3 years ago, a trapper running from debt who drank his stores, stole his mare, and left him tied in the barn for a day and a half. But these weren't men. These were Apache widows. He could see it in how they stood, proud, worn, not broken. He opened the gate without a word. They entered one by one, slow, watching him as they passed. He caught the smell of blood and pine needles in their clothes. One of them, older than the rest, tall and broad-hipped with deep lines etched into her face, nodded once. She didn't thank him. Inside, the fire burned low. Reed added a split log, moved the kettle, pulled 6 tin bowls from the shelf. He ladled stew from the night before, thick with roots and meat, and handed the bowls over without comment. They sat in a loose circle near the hearth. The woman who had spoken, Cyan, knelt closest to the fire, palms open toward the heat. Her dress was torn across the chest, stitched once and torn again. The skin beneath was sun-darkened and damp with cold. She didn't hide it. Reed felt his throat tighten, not with desire or shame, but with anger toward whoever had done this. The youngest, Tala, trembled as she ate, silent, wide-eyed, swallowing carefully. They hadn't come for charity. They'd come because there was nowhere left. After supper, Reed handed out folded wool blankets. He didn't ask names. He didn't offer conversation. People who'd been hunted didn't trust that kind of kindness. He laid out 2 spare bedrolls near the stove. The floor was hard, but warmer than the night outside. He placed the last blanket near Cyan. She looked up at him, eyes sharp, assessing his posture, his belt, the weight of the weapon there. She knew he was armed. She knew he was alone. She knew what he could do. He did nothing. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees and watched the dark. Behind him the women settled. Someone whispered softly in a language he didn't fully catch. Someone laughed once, low and brief. Cyan murmured back, then silence. It sounded like home, or the memory of one. Reed didn't truly sleep. He listened to the fire. Crack, and the wind scraped the boards, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Responsibility, heavy as the snow on the roof. Morning came sharp and pale. Reed had slept in the chair, boots still on, rifle across his lap. He listened before moving. All 5 women slept breath even. The fire was down to coals. The tall one, Pa, lay closest to the door. Tala slept curled into herself. Reed moved quietly, rebuilt the fire, set the kettle on. As the first light slid across the floor, Cyan stirred. She watched him. Without speaking, he nodded once. She stood, took the coffee tin when he handed it to her, measured the grounds by feel. By the time the others woke, the cabin smelled of coffee and heat. They ate the same stew again. No one complained. Afterward, Cyan stepped outside. The others followed. Reed stayed in, watching through the window. They moved with purpose. Cyan checked the goat pen. Pa circled the cabin, eyes on the hills. Ka mended a blanket. Nolly hauled water without being asked. They weren't guests. Reed stepped out and returned to the woodpile. Cyan joined him, stacking kindling beside the wall. She moved stiffly, sore but determined. Her dress clung damply to her legs, torn wider now, exposing skin she didn't acknowledge. Or perhaps she did and simply didn't care. Midday came thin and pale. Reed set out his supplies. Flour, salt, dried pork. Ka and Nolly began kneading dough with practiced hands. He watched without interrupting. The questions gathered, but he kept them to himself. Later, Cyan stood in the doorway and spoke. They had come from below Fort Garland. White ranchers, drunk, looking for warriors who weren't there. Their shelter burned, their men already gone. 5 days walking in snow. Reed nodded once. That evening he set out extra tools. He didn't explain. By dusk, the back gate was patched, the latch fixed, the curtains sewn. He sat on the porch with his coffee and watched them move, as if the place had always been theirs. No one asked what he wanted in return. That night they slept closer to the stove. Pa by the door again. Cyan near Reed's chair. She spoke softly once, about what men expected. Reed said nothing. She studied him, then rolled away. Snow fell hard in the night. By morning the world was muffled and still. Reed sharpened a blade at the table. Cyan moved at the stove. The others worked quietly. Reed unfolded a worn map and showed her a trail down the valley. Not as dismissal, but as truth. She told him Tala couldn't walk anymore. He brought salve, set it down, let Tala tend herself. That afternoon the cabin filled with small work, repairs, rest. Cyan split wood with a strength earned the hard way. That night they ate rabbit stew. The tear in Cyan's dress shifted as she sat, unhidden. Reed noticed. He didn't stare. She watched to see if he would flinch. He didn't. Later, when the others slept, she stood near him and spoke again. About expectations, about fear. Reed met her eyes and said only that he wasn't like the others. She stepped close, kissed him once, slow and certain, then walked away. Reed watched the fire long after, knowing something had shifted, knowing he didn't want them to leave, and knowing that thoughts scared him more than solitude. Reed woke earlier than usual, not because of sound, but because the cold had crept in when the fire died low in the night. Smoke still lingered, thick in the air. He sat up in the chair by the stove, worked the stiffness from his neck and scanned the room. All of them were still there. Cyan curled on her side facing the coals. Pa near the door as always. Ka sprawled protectively across Tala's legs. Nolly on her back, hands folded on her chest. Reed stood, careful not to wake them, rebuilt the fire, poured water into the kettle. As he did, Cyan rose silently and stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. She spoke low. She'd thought he might be gone by morning. He answered that he never went far. She studied him, said he always lived on the edge like this. Outside, snow fell thin and steady. She poured 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking. He drank, then asked about the men who had attacked their shelter. She told him about the night raid, the lies, the beating, the food taken, the fire set. Reed glanced at Noli's sleeping face and understood more than she said. Protection, out here, came from who stood beside you, not from law. After breakfast, Reed went to check his traps. Snow coated the valley, sky clearing slowly. He caught enough to stretch meals another day. When he returned, he slowed at the ridge. Smoke rose not just from the chimney, but from behind the shed. His hand drifted near his holster until he saw Sion kneeling by a new fire pit. The others working in calm rhythm. Nolly boiled cloth. Car scraped hides. Tala sat wrapped in blankets, foot bandaged, smiling faintly. Her stood when she saw him, alert but calm. Sion explained they'd built an outdoor fire to save wood. Reed handed her the rabbits. That night they ate together at the table. When Noli laughed softly at something Car said, Reed felt something ease in his chest. Later, Sion stayed by the fire while the others slept. She accused him gently of waiting for them to ask for more. He denied it. She pressed a hand to his chest, felt his steady heart, then kissed him. Slow, intentional. When she pulled away, she said goodnight and left him sitting still, staring into flame, no longer guarding the door. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Snow eased. Light lingered longer. They woke, worked, warmed, slept. Sion said nothing of the kiss, but moved closer now, deliberate. Reed didn't flinch. He rode down to the lower pass for salt one morning, leaving before sunrise. Zayan steadied his coat and fixed his collar without a word. When he returned, something felt wrong before he saw it. Bud told him a man had come, white, mid-30s, deputy star, asking questions. Sion said he'd seen them through the trees. Reed asked if he'd touched anyone. He hadn't, but he'd asked why they were there, under whose authority. Sion had said they worked for Reed, that they weren't prisoners. Reed stepped outside, scanned the land. The unease didn't pass. That night the fire burned long. Reed and Pa stayed awake. Sion watched the window. The outside world had noticed them. In the morning, Reed took Tala to the shed and showed her how to brace doors. Reed tracks, set traps. Her hands steadied. When they returned, she nodded once to Sion. Later, Reed and Sion stood behind the cabin. She admitted she'd been wrong to think they were a burden. He brushed hair from her cheek and kissed her. Again, longer. This time she stayed beside him. December closed in hard. Snow fell for days, sealing them in. Wood rationed, meals stretched. No one complained. Tala healed. She spoke more. Sion stayed close to Reed, sharing warmth, sharing work, sharing silence. On the 4th night, Noli asked what would happen in spring. Reed answered honestly. Papers could be written, stories made official. Sion kissed him in front of them all. Later that night, she stayed. This time she didn't walk away. They came together quietly, without ceremony, warmth shared under firelight. When it ended, she stayed curled against him, and Reed held her with both arms for the first time in years. The storm still raged outside, but inside something steady had been built. The snow stopped mid-January. Tracks appeared again. Someone watched from the ridge. Reed offered them a way out. None took it. Tala held his hand and said she wanted to stay. Preparations replaced fear. By spring thaw, they were no longer strangers under one roof. They were something else entirely, and none of them were planning to leave. The thaw didn't come cleanly. It crept in the way everything honest did, slow and uncertain, testing whether it would be allowed to stay. Snow softened into slush, then froze again at night. Streams whispered beneath the crust. Reed walked the ridge every morning and every evening, rifle slung but unused, eyes trained on the tree line. He never found fresh tracks, never found proof that the watcher had returned. Yet the sense of being seen never fully left him. Inside the cabin, life pressed forward anyway. Tala's wound closed completely. She stopped favoring her foot and started carrying weight again. Boards, water, tools, her confidence returning in quiet increments. Gar baked with what flour remained, proud when Reed said the biscuits reminded him of his mother's, though she only nodded and went back to work. Nolly carved symbols into the walls with a careful hand, small marks that felt more like protection than decoration. Pa rebuilt sections of the porch and reinforced the goat shed as if expecting trouble. Not out of fear, but readiness. Cyan stayed closest to Reed. There was no more circling. At night, she slept in his room, her presence steady, grounding. They didn't speak of love, but it lived in the way she reached for him when the cold woke her, in the way he stirred her coffee before handing it over, in how they moved around each other like they'd always known the rhythm. One night, lying with her head on his chest, she asked what they would say if the lawman came back. Reed thought a long time before answering. If he asked whether they belonged there, Reed said, then they did. All of them. The next morning he pulled out the old ledger and began writing. Names, dates, statements of residence. He listed them as kin, not owned, not hired, but protected. When he finished, Pa read the pages first. She nodded once and passed them on. By dusk, none of the women had packed a single thing. Reed rode down to Canyon Post the next day. When he returned with stamped papers, the household was no longer a question. That night, Cyan undid her dress slowly and stepped into his arms. This time, there was no hesitation left between them. They came together without fear, without the need to prove anything, only to share what had already taken root. Spring followed. The snow vanished in patches, then fully. Green pushed through soil. Corn sprouted behind the shed. The land accepted them. Word traveled through town, but it burned out quickly. When the clerk rode up and found the papers in order and the cabin whole, there was nothing to challenge. One evening, as Cyan rinsed cloth behind the cabin, Reed asked her to marry him. She didn't smile right away. She asked if it was about law or protection. When he said no, when he told her why, she pressed her forehead to his chest and agreed on her terms. They married under the spruce tree 2 days later. No preacher, no crowd. Just them, just the truth of staying. That night, as they sat on the porch together, Cyan rested a hand on her stomach and told him quietly what was coming. Reed held her tighter and didn't look afraid. Spring didn't arrive all at once, but it arrived enough. The danger never returned. The cabin filled with laughter, with work, with song. Reed smiled more. He stopped guarding every word. He had not planned to build a family, but he had one. And it held. Summer came like a promise kept. The valley opened, green and generous, and the cabin no longer felt like a place of refuge, but of choosing. Doors stayed unbarred. Windows stayed open. Reed woke to birds instead of worry. Cyan's belly rounded slowly, her movements careful but unafraid. Tala followed her everywhere, eager, asking questions about names and seasons. Ka planted beans along the fence and sang while she worked. Nolly's symbols spread from walls to beams, quiet prayers etched into wood. Pa took to sitting on the porch at dusk, rifle across her knees, more out of habit than need, watching a future she'd decided to trust. The child came early one morning after a night of rain. No drama, no shouting, just breath, grip, endurance. Reed stayed near, steady hands, steady voice. When the cry finally filled the room, something in him broke open that had been closed for decades. A daughter! Small, fierce, alive. Cyan rested back against the pillows, sweat-soaked and smiling, and placed the baby against his chest. He did not move for a long time. They named her Hope. Life didn't soften because of it. Work still waited. Storms still came. But the edge was gone. Reed taught Tala to read the land and Ka to ride. Nolly took the baby on her hip and told her stories that mixed truth and protection until you couldn't tell which was which. Pa stood godmother without ceremony. Visitors came sometimes, curious, cautious. They left satisfied. The land answered only to those who stayed. One autumn evening, years later, Reed stood on the ridge again, same place where he'd once felt watched. The valley below glowed with lamplight, smoke rising from more than one chimney now. He felt no eyes on his back, only the weight of memory and the lightness of what had followed it. Cyan joined him, Hope asleep in her arms, hair dark like her mother's, eyes like the land. Reed wrapped an arm around them both. He had given shelter once, thinking it would be temporary. He had learned that some doors, once opened, were meant to stay that way.